Hi, my name is Natalie Brooks, and the day my mother told me I didn't deserve happiness, I believed her. For years, I shaped myself into whatever version they wanted, trying to earn love that was never mine to begin with. But when I met him, when I fell in love with someone they deemed unworthy, they didn't just disapprove. They tried to erase me completely. At my family's annual gala, surrounded by everyone who mattered in their world, my mother stood at that podium and announced I was a disappointment to the Brooks name. The room fell silent. I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. But then the doors opened. A man in formal military dress walked in, and my mother's face drained of every ounce of color. Do you think you know what happened next? Stay with me, because what unfolded that night changed everything I thought I knew about my worth, my family, and the life I was meant to live. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The thing about growing up in the Brooks family is that you learn early on that love isn't free. It comes with conditions, with expectations that wrap around your throat like silk scarves, beautiful on the surface but suffocating underneath. Every Sunday without fail, we gathered at the estate on Millbrook Drive for dinner. The house itself was a monument to everything my family valued. Appearances, legacy, the kind of wealth that whispers rather than shouts. Colonial columns framed the entrance, and inside, Persian rugs stretched across hardwood floors that gleamed under the light of antique fixtures my great-grandmother had imported from France. I grew up walking those halls carefully, always aware that one wrong step could echo through the entire house. My older brother Brandon learned early how to play their game. He married Vanessa, a woman whose family name opened doors across 3 states, and together they produced 2 perfectly behaved children who smiled on command. At every Sunday dinner, they sat across from me like a portrait of everything I was supposed to become but never quite managed. My mother, Patricia Brooks, presided over these dinners with the precision of a general commanding troops. Her blonde hair never moved, sprayed into submission every morning at the salon she'd been loyal to for 30 years. She wore pearls even on Tuesdays, and her lipstick shade had a name I'd heard 1,000 times but could never remember. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table, nodding along to whatever my mother declared, his silence a vote of confidence in her every judgment. I was 28 years old and I still felt like a child at that table, waiting for permission to speak, to exist, to breathe wrong without commentary. It was a Sunday in late September when everything started to crack open. The air had that quality it gets in early autumn, crisp enough to remind you that nothing lasts forever. I'd spent the morning at the Ashford Museum of Fine Arts, where I worked as a curator in the European paintings department. It was the one space in my life where I felt like I could breathe, where beauty existed for its own sake, rather than as a status symbol to display at cocktail parties. That particular morning, we'd received a private visitor, someone the director insisted on giving a personal tour. I was in the restoration lab when Julia, my colleague, poked her head in and said there was someone who wanted to meet the curator responsible for the Baroque collection. I wiped my hands on my apron, annoyed at the interruption, and walked out into the gallery expecting some donor's nephew who wanted to feel important. Instead, I found a man standing in front of the Caravaggio, hands clasped behind his back, studying the play of light and shadow with an intensity that made me pause. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed simply in dark jeans and a gray sweater that looked expensive in that understated European way. When he turned at the sound of my footsteps, his eyes were the kind of blue that made you forget what you were going to say. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face from serious to warm in an instant. "You must be the curator," he said, his accent placing him somewhere in Europe, refined but not stuffy. "I've been admiring your collection. The way you've arranged the lighting on the Artemisia Gentileschi piece is extraordinary. Most museums get it wrong." I blinked, caught off guard. Most visitors couldn't tell Artemisia from her father Orazio, let alone have opinions about gallery lighting. We talked for over an hour. He asked questions that revealed a deep knowledge of art history, and when I mentioned I was working on restoring a damaged altarpiece from a private collection, his whole face lit up with genuine interest. He told me he'd grown up around art, that his family had a collection they opened to the public twice a year, that he'd always been drawn to the work of preservation rather than acquisition. His name was Alexander, though he insisted I call him Alex. He didn't mention a last name and I didn't ask. There was something refreshing about talking to someone who engaged with the art rather than using it as a backdrop for networking. When he finally had to leave, he hesitated at the gallery entrance and asked if I'd be interested in getting coffee sometime. Not as a collector or a donor, he added quickly. Just as someone who'd like to keep talking to you. I said yes before I could overthink it. That evening at Sunday dinner, I was still thinking about him, replaying our conversation, wondering if I'd imagined the connection I'd felt. My mother's voice cut through my thoughts like a knife through butter. "Natalie," she said sharply. "Are you even listening? Brandon was just telling us about his promotion." I looked up to find everyone staring at me. "Sorry," I said automatically, the apology rising to my lips like it always did. "Congratulations, Brandon." My brother smirked, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "Thanks, Nat. Some of us are taking our careers seriously." He exchanged a glance with Vanessa, who smiled that tight smile she always wore around me, the one that said she was in on a joke I'd never understand. My mother set down her fork with deliberate precision. "Speaking of careers, Natalie, Gloria Pemberton mentioned she hasn't seen you at any of the young professionals events this quarter. You know how important it is to maintain visibility in the right circles." "I've been busy with work," I said quietly. "We're preparing for the Renaissance exhibition." "The museum," my mother said. And the way she pronounced it made it sound like something distasteful she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "Darling, it's a lovely hobby, but at some point you need to think about your future. You're not getting any younger, and frankly, spending your days with dusty paintings isn't going to help you meet the right kind of people." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the sensation that the dining room was shrinking, the air growing thinner. What my mother meant by the right kind of people was someone from one of the approved families, someone whose last name appeared in the same social registers as ours, someone who would elevate or at least maintain our position in Ashford's carefully calibrated hierarchy. "Actually," I said, surprised by my own voice, "I met someone interesting this week." The table went silent. My mother's eyes sharpened with interest. "Oh, who is he? What family?" "His name is Alexander," I continued, feeling my way through the conversation like I was walking across ice, unsure if it would hold. "He's European. We met at the museum. He has a deep appreciation for art and we're getting coffee this week." My mother's interest visibly cooled. "European," she repeated. "Doing what exactly? Is he in finance? Diplomacy?" "He didn't specify," I admitted. "We mostly talked about art history." Vanessa laughed, a sound like tinkling glass. "How romantic. A mysterious European who hangs around museums. Very sound basis for a relationship." Brandon joined in. "Just make sure he's not after the family money, Nat. You've always been a bit naive about these things." The words stung because there was a kernel of truth in them, or at least a kernel of my own insecurity. I'd never been good at reading people's intentions, never developed the cynicism that seemed to come naturally to the rest of my family. I wanted to believe people were genuine until proven otherwise, which my mother had told me repeatedly was a character flaw that would get me hurt. My father finally spoke, his voice mild but with an edge of warning. "Your mother and I just want you to be careful, Natalie. We've worked hard to build this family's reputation. The choices you make reflect on all of us." What he meant was, "Don't embarrass us." What he meant was, "Your happiness matters less than our standing." What he meant was, "You belong to us and we'll decide what's acceptable." I made it through the rest of dinner in silence, pushing food around my plate while Brandon held court about his latest business deal, and Vanessa described in excruciating detail. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The private school they were considering for their eldest. When I finally escaped to my car, I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to remember how to breathe normally. My phone buzzed with a text. It was from my grandmother Maggie, my father's mother, who lived across town in a beautiful brownstone in the historic district. She rarely came to Sunday dinners anymore, claiming her health wasn't up to it, though I suspected the truth was she couldn't stomach the performance we all put on. The text read, "Come see me tomorrow for tea. I heard you met someone special. Let's talk about it away from the peacocks." I smiled despite myself. My grandmother had always been different from the rest of the family, softer around the edges, more interested in substance than surface. She'd traveled extensively in her youth, lived abroad for years, and had stories she'd sometimes share late at night when it was just the two of us. There was a whole life she'd lived that no one talked about, chapters my father would change the subject about if I asked too many questions. The next day, I drove to Magnolia Terrace as the afternoon light slanted golden through the oak trees lining her street. Her brownstone was elegant without being ostentatious, filled with artifacts from her travels. Carved wooden masks from West Africa, delicate porcelain from Japan, faded photographs in silver frames showing a younger version of my grandmother in evening gowns, standing beside people I didn't recognize. She met me at the door in a flowing silk dress the color of peacock feathers, her white hair swept up in a loose bun. "Come in, darling," she said, kissing both my cheeks in the European way she'd never abandoned. "I've made your favorite tea. And I want to hear everything about this mysterious man who has your mother so worried." We settled in her parlor, surrounded by books and afternoon light. I told her about Alex, about our conversation in the museum, about how easy it had been to talk to him, how he'd looked at the paintings like they mattered, how he'd asked about my work with genuine curiosity rather than polite disinterest. My grandmother listened with the kind of attention that made you feel heard, really heard, in a way my parents never managed. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, a small smile playing at her lips. "Alexander," she repeated softly. "And he didn't mention his family name?" "No," I said. "Is that strange?" "Not necessarily," she replied, setting down her teacup with care. "Some people prefer to be known for themselves rather than their lineage. It's actually quite refreshing." She paused, studying my face. "You like him?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I do. I don't know why. We just connected in a way I haven't felt with anyone before." My grandmother reached across and took my hand. "Then follow that feeling, Natalie. Don't let your mother's fears or your family's expectations steal something that could be beautiful. I made that mistake once and I spent years regretting it." I looked at her, startled. "You did?" Her eyes grew distant, focusing on something beyond the room. "I was young, living abroad, working at an embassy. I met someone extraordinary, someone who saw me for who I was rather than what I represented. But the timing was complicated, and I listened to the voices telling me to be practical, to be sensible, to think of my family's position." She squeezed my hand. "I married your grandfather instead, and he was a good man, but there was always a part of me that wondered what if." I'd never heard this story before. The weight of it settled between us, heavy with years of might-have-beens. "Who was he?" I asked quietly. She smiled mysteriously. "Someone whose path I hope you'll cross one day. But that's a story for another time. For now, just know this. Your mother is terrified of anything she can't control, and your father has forgotten how to want anything beyond what she tells him to want. Don't become them. Don't let their small ambitions make your life small." I left her house feeling something shift inside me, like a door opening that I hadn't known was locked. When Alex texted me that evening to confirm coffee for Thursday, I responded immediately with enthusiasm. I didn't try to hide. We met at a small cafe in the Arts District, far from anywhere my family would frequent. He was waiting at a corner table when I arrived, and he stood when he saw me, that smile transforming his face again. We talked for 3 hours. He told me about growing up in Valdoria, a small European kingdom I barely heard of, wedged between France and Switzerland. It was beautiful, he said, all mountains and medieval architecture, and a culture that valued art and education above almost everything else. His family was involved in cultural preservation, he explained vaguely, and he'd spent much of his childhood in museums and libraries, which was why he felt so at home in them now. I told him about my family, though I softened the edges, made them sound merely traditional rather than suffocating. I talked about my work at the museum, about the satisfaction of bringing damaged paintings back to life, of uncovering layers of old varnish to reveal colors that hadn't been seen in centuries. He listened like every word mattered, asked follow-up questions that showed he was truly paying attention. When we finally left the cafe, the streetlights were coming on, casting pools of gold on the sidewalk. He walked me to my car and hesitated, hands in his pockets. "I'd really like to see you again," he said, "if you're interested." "I am," I replied, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. Over the next few weeks we fell into a pattern. He was in Ashford for an extended visit, Something to do with cultural exchange programs between Valdoria and American museums. We met for coffee, for walks through the historic district, for quiet dinners at restaurants where no one knew my name. With him, I felt like I could be the version of myself I'd always wanted to be. Curious, passionate about my work, unafraid to laugh loudly or gesture wildly when I got excited about something. I didn't tell my family about any of it. The Sunday dinners continued, and I sat through them with the same practiced smile, deflecting questions about my social life, enduring my mother's pointed comments about my ticking biological clock and my brother's smugness about his perfect nuclear family. But now I had something that was mine, something they couldn't touch or taint with their judgments. It was my grandmother who finally asked, one afternoon when I stopped by for tea, "You're glowing, darling. I assume this means things are going well with Alexander?" I couldn't help the smile that spread across my face. "Really well. Grandma, I think I'm falling in love with him." She set down her cup, her expression serious. "Have you told your parents you're still seeing him?" "No," I admitted. "I know what they'll say. That I don't know enough about his background, that I'm being reckless, that I should focus on meeting someone appropriate." The word tasted bitter in my mouth. My grandmother was quiet for a long moment. "Natalie," she said finally, "there's something I should tell you about Alexander." My heart dropped. "What do you mean?" She stood and walked to an antique secretary desk in the corner, pulling out a small leather photo album I'd never seen before. She returned to her seat and opened it carefully, turning to a page near the middle. The photograph showed a younger version of my grandmother in an elegant evening gown, standing in what looked like a palace ballroom. Beside her was a handsome man in military dress, and next to him, a woman wearing a tiara. "That," my grandmother said quietly, pointing to the man, "is King Henrik of Valdoria. And that is Queen Caroline. I worked in their household for several years when I was young, first as a translator, then as a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. She was one of my dearest friends." I stared at the photograph, my mind struggling to process what she was telling me. "You worked for the royal family of Valdoria?" "I did," she confirmed. "And when you described Alexander to me, described his mannerisms, his knowledge of art, his connection to cultural preservation, I suspected. But I wanted to be sure before I said anything." "Sure of what?" I whispered, though part of me already knew. My grandmother turned another page in the album. The photograph showed a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, standing beside Queen Caroline. He had dark hair and bright blue eyes, and even at that age, his serious expression was unmistakable. "That," she said gently, "is Prince Alexander Henrik Frederick of Valdoria, the Queen's second son. And unless I'm very much mistaken, he's the man you've been spending your evenings with." The world tilted sideways. I gripped the arm of my chair, trying to anchor myself to something solid. "He's a prince," I said, the words sounding absurd even as I spoke them. "He is," my grandmother confirmed. "And from what you've told me about how he's behaved, how he's approached getting to know you, I suspect he wanted you to know him as simply Alex first. The title can change how people relate to you, make them see the crown before they see the person." I sat there in my grandmother's parlor, the photograph of young Prince Alexander still in my hands, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. The afternoon light streaming through the lace curtains suddenly felt too bright, too harsh, illuminating a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. My grandmother watched me with patient eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen enough of the world to know when to speak and when to simply wait. "He never lied to me," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I was trying to convince myself as much as explain it to her. "He just didn't tell me everything." "Is there a difference?" my grandmother asked gently, though her tone held no judgment. She reached across and squeezed my hand. "Darling, I'm not telling you this to upset you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you're walking into. Your mother is difficult enough when she thinks you're dating someone without the right Ashford pedigree. Can you imagine how she'll react when she discovers you've been seeing European royalty?" The thought made my stomach turn. My mother, who measured worth by social standing and bank accounts, who had spent years trying to orchestrate my life like one of her charity galas, who believed happiness was something you earned through proper marriage and appropriate connections. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent months hiding a relationship because I thought Alex wasn't good enough for them. And now I was discovering he was so far above their aspirations they wouldn't even know how to process it. "I don't understand why he didn't tell me," I said, setting the photograph down with trembling hands. We've talked about everything. His childhood, his love of art, his family's dedication to cultural preservation. He made it sound so normal. Perhaps that's exactly what he wanted, my grandmother suggested. To be normal, at least for a little while. To be seen as Alex rather than Prince Alexander. Royalty, especially in the smaller kingdoms, can be quite lonely. Everyone wants something from you, everyone has an agenda. Maybe he just wanted to meet someone who saw him first. Her words made sense, but they didn't ease the confusion tangling in my chest. I thought about all our conversations, searching for moments where he might have been trying to tell me hints I'd missed. There had been comments about official obligations he needed to return home for, vague references to family expectations that sounded heavy when he spoke about them. Once, when I'd complained about my mother's controlling nature, he'd said something I hadn't fully understood at the time. At least your choices are your own, even if she makes them difficult. Some of us have our futures written before we're old enough to hold a pen. I need to talk to him, I said, standing abruptly. The teacup rattled in its saucer as I set it down. I need to hear this from him. My grandmother nodded, rising with the grace that age and experience had given her. Just remember, Natalie, that fear makes people do complicated things. Whatever his reasons for not telling you immediately, I suspect they came from a place of wanting to protect something precious. Don't let your hurt blind you to his heart. I drove back to my apartment in the Arts District with my mind spinning, barely registering the familiar streets. My phone sat heavy in my purse, and twice I reached for it to text Alex before pulling my hand back. This wasn't a conversation for messages or phone calls. This required seeing his face, hearing his voice without the filter of technology between us. My apartment felt different when I walked in, smaller somehow, like the walls had shifted closer while I was gone. It was modest compared to the Brooks estate, compared to my grandmother's elegant brownstone, definitely modest compared to what I now knew about Alex's background. The furniture was second-hand, carefully chosen from estate sales and antique shops. The walls were covered with prints of paintings I loved, alongside my own amateur attempts at watercolor. There was a crack in the ceiling I kept meaning to have the landlord fix, and the kitchen faucet dripped no matter how tightly I turned the handle. But it was mine. I'd chosen every piece, arranged everything according to my own taste rather than following some decorator's vision or family tradition. For the first time, I wondered what Alex had thought when he'd come here for dinner last week. Had he compared it to palace rooms? Had he noticed the mismatched dishes, the bookshelf made from cinder blocks and reclaimed wood? He'd said it felt like me, warm and authentic, and I glowed under the compliment. Now I wondered if there had been pity underneath the praise. I was spiraling, I knew it, but I couldn't stop. Every interaction replayed through a new lens. The way he'd hesitated before telling me about his family's involvement in cultural preservation. The evening he'd received a phone call in rapid French and stepped outside to take it, returning with an apologetic smile and a vague explanation about official business. The fact that he'd always suggested we meet at places away from the museum, away from anywhere we might be photographed or recognized. My phone buzzed. A text from Alex. I have something important to talk to you about. Can we meet tomorrow evening? I know a place where we won't be disturbed. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to demand answers right now. But another part, the part that my grandmother's words had touched, wanted to give him the chance to tell me himself, in his own time and his own way. I typed back a simple response. Tomorrow works. Where should I meet you? His reply came quickly with an address I didn't recognize, somewhere on the outskirts of the city. 7 o'clock. And Natalie, thank you for trusting me with this. I set the phone down and sank onto my second-hand couch, pulling a throw pillow against my chest. The autumn evening darkened outside my window, and I watched the lights come on across the neighborhood, little squares of gold marking other people's lives, other people's stories. I wondered how many of them were sitting in their homes discovering that the person they were falling in love with was someone completely different from who they'd imagined. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching car headlights sweep across the plaster, creating moving shadows that felt appropriate for my mood. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photograph of young Alexander standing beside Queen Caroline, his expression so serious, so weighted with responsibility even at 10 years old. I thought about the Alex I knew, the one who laughed at my terrible jokes and listened with genuine interest when I went on too long about Renaissance painting techniques. Were they the same person, or had I been falling in love with a performance? The next day at work dragged endlessly. I moved through the gallery like a ghost, barely able to focus on the restoration project in front of me. The damaged altarpiece that had consumed my attention for weeks now seemed trivial, unimportant compared to the conversation waiting for me that evening. My colleague Julia noticed, asking twice if I was feeling well, if I needed to go home early. I assured her I was fine, though we both knew it was a lie. At 6:30, I left the museum and drove to the address Alex had sent. It led me out of the city proper, into rolling hills where old estates sat behind iron gates and ancient oak trees. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and for a moment I let myself appreciate the beauty of it before anxiety clamped down on my chest again. The address belonged to a small estate, elegant but not ostentatious, the kind of place that whispered old money rather than shouting it. The gates were open, and I drove up a curved driveway lined with maples just beginning to turn color. Alex was waiting on the front steps, and when he saw my car he stood, his hands sliding into his pockets in that gesture I'd come to recognize as nervousness. I parked and got out, my legs unsteady beneath me. He walked toward me, and in the golden evening light I saw him differently now, saw the way he carried himself with unconscious authority, the way his simple clothes somehow looked more refined than my brother's expensive suits. How had I missed it? How had I not seen what was so obvious now? "Natalie," he said, and just my name in his voice nearly undid me. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I replied honestly. "My grandmother told me who you really are." His expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something resigned. "Lady Margaret," he said softly. Of course. I should have realized she'd recognize me. She was always remarkably perceptive. "You know my grandmother," I said, though it wasn't really a question. "I do," he confirmed. "Or I did when I was young. She was kind to a lonely boy who spent too much time hiding in the palace library. She used to sneak me biscuits during formal dinners and tell me stories about the paintings in the gallery." He smiled at the memory, but it faded quickly. "I was going to tell you tonight. I've been trying to find the right moment, the right words." "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" I asked, and hated how small my voice sounded. "Why let me think you were just some art enthusiast passing through town?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd never seen from him before. "Because that's exactly what I wanted to be," he said. "Just someone who loves art. Someone who could have a normal conversation without the weight of titles and protocols and everyone's assumptions. Do you know how exhausting it is to never be sure if people like you or like your position? To wonder if every interaction is genuine or calculated?" I wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to the feeling of betrayal that had kept me awake all night. But standing there in the evening light, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, I felt my resolve wavering. "So you lied to me?" "I didn't lie," he said firmly. "I just didn't tell you everything. Everything I've shared with you, everything I've felt, that's been real. More real than anything I've experienced in years. The title, the duties, the expectations, those are things I was born into. But Alex, the person who talks with you about Caravaggio and laughs at your stories about museum donors, that's who I actually am underneath everything else." I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the mild evening. "My mother is going to lose her mind when she finds out." He stepped closer, his voice gentle. "Is that what you're worried about? Your mother's reaction?" "I'm worried about a lot of things," I admitted. "I'm worried that you'll go back to Valdoria and I'll just be a brief interlude in your life, a moment of normal before you return to palaces and protocols. I'm worried that I've fallen for someone I can never really have because your world and mine are too different. I'm worried that my family will either try to use this connection for their own social climbing, or reject it entirely because they can't control it." He reached out and took my hands, his touch warm and solid and real. "Natalie, listen to me. Yes, I'm a prince. Yes, I have obligations and responsibilities waiting for me in Valdoria. But I came to Ashford specifically because I was looking for something my life has been missing. I'm second in line to the throne, which means I have more freedom than my older brother. I can choose my own path, at least to some extent. And I'm choosing to tell you that what we have, this connection, it matters to me. You matter to me. The sincerity in his voice cracked something open inside me. "How is this supposed to work?" I whispered. "You're a prince. I'm a museum curator who lives in an apartment with a leaky faucet." He smiled, really smiled, and it transformed his whole face. I happen to think museum curators are incredibly impressive. And I'm quite good with plumbing, actually. Palace maintenance training. It's very thorough. Despite everything, I laughed. It burst out of me unexpectedly, releasing some of the tension coiled in my chest. "This is insane," I said. "This whole situation is completely insane." "I know," he agreed. "But some of the best things in life are a little insane." He squeezed my hands gently. "Can we start over? Not from the beginning, because I don't want to lose what we've built. But from right now, with everything out in the open." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw both the prince and the Alex I'd fallen for, understanding finally that they were one and the same. The title didn't erase the person, it was just another layer of who he was. "Okay," I said slowly. "But no more secrets. For doing this, I need honesty." "No more secrets," he promised. He glanced toward the house behind him. "I borrowed this estate from a friend for the evening. I thought we could have dinner, just the two of us, and I could tell you everything. About my family, about Valdoria, about what my life actually looks like when I'm not pretending to be a normal tourist." We went inside, and over a meal he'd apparently cooked himself, he told me everything. About growing up in Valdoria's palace. About the responsibilities and expectations that had shaped his entire life. About his older brother Henrik, who would one day be king, and who handled the pressure with the ease Alex had never managed. About his mother, Queen Caroline, who believed in duty above all else but who had also encouraged her sons to pursue their passions within the constraints of their positions. He told me about the loneliness of being royal, about the way people treated you like a symbol rather than a person, about relationships that had failed because the women involved wanted the crown more than they wanted him, about the desperation he'd felt to find something real, something untainted by his title and position. "I've been coming to America for years," he explained, "because here no one knows who I am. I can blend in, be anonymous. When I saw the announcement about the Ashford Museum's new Baroque collection, I requested to be part of the cultural exchange program specifically so I could come here. I thought I'd spend a few months studying, maybe work on some research projects. I never expected to walk into that gallery and meet you." "What happens when you go back?" I asked quietly. We'd finished eating, and we were sitting in a small library, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. "What happens to us?" He set down his wine glass and turned to face me fully. "That depends on you. I need to return to Valdoria in a few weeks. There are obligations I can't avoid, ceremonies I need to attend. But I'd like you to come with me. I'd like you to see my world, meet my family, understand what my life is really like. And then, if you still want this, if you think you can handle everything that comes with being involved with someone in my position, we'll figure it out together." My heart hammered against my ribs. "You want me to meet the Queen of Valdoria?" "I want you to meet my mother," he corrected gently. "Yes, she's the queen, but she's also just a woman who wants her sons to be happy. She was the one who encouraged me to take this time away, to find something real. I think she'll like you. I think she'll see what I see." "And what's that?" I asked, barely breathing. "Someone extraordinary," he said simply. "Someone who's passionate about her work, who sees beauty in the world, who isn't afraid to be herself even when her family tries to make her into something else. Someone I'm falling in love with." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning and possibility and risk. I thought about my mother's face when she found out, about the chaos this would unleash in my carefully controlled family. I thought about the Sunday dinners and the constant criticism and the way they tried to shrink me down into someone manageable, someone appropriate, someone who fit their narrow definition of acceptable. And then I thought about Alex, about the way he looked at me like I mattered, about conversations that lasted hours because we never ran out of things to say, about feeling seen and valued and cherished for exactly who I was. "I'm falling in love with you too," I said, and watched his face transform with relief and joy. "But I'm terrified. Of your world, of my family's reaction, of everything changing." "Change is terrifying," he agreed. "But staying in a life that makes you small is worse. I've watched you, Natalie. I've seen the way you dim yourself at those Sunday dinners your grandmother mentioned, the way you make yourself smaller to fit their expectations. You deserve so much more than that." He was right. I knew he was right. But knowing something and having the courage to act on it were two different things entirely. We talked late into the night, until the fire burned down to embers and the moon rose high outside the windows. He told me about Valdoria, about the mountains and the medieval architecture, and the culture that valued education and art above military might or economic power. He showed me pictures on his phone of the palace where he'd grown up, of the capital city with its narrow cobblestone streets and flower boxes overflowing with geraniums. He talked about his work with cultural preservation programs, about his dream of making Valdoria's royal art collection more accessible to scholars and the public. And I told him about my family, really told him this time without softening the edges, about my mother's controlling nature and my father's passivity, about Brandon's smugness and the way I'd always felt like a disappointment, like no matter what I achieved it would never be enough, about the loneliness of growing up in a house full of people who saw you as a project to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. When he finally drove me back to my apartment in the early hours of morning, I felt wrung out but somehow lighter. He walked me to my door and kissed me gently, his hands cradling my face like I was something precious. "Thank you," he said softly, "for hearing me out, for giving this a chance." "I'm still scared," I admitted. "So am I," he replied. "But maybe being scared together is better than being safe and alone." I went inside and stood in my small living room, looking at my second-hand furniture and amateur paintings, and the life I'd built for myself away from my family's expectations. In a few weeks, I might be flying to Europe to meet a queen. In a few weeks, everything I knew might change completely. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't changing for someone else's approval. I was choosing something for myself, taking a risk on something real, stepping into the unknown because staying safe had started to feel like slowly suffocating. I picked up my phone and texted my grandmother. "You were right. About everything. Thank you for telling me." Her response came immediately, despite the late hour. "I'm proud of you, darling. Now comes the hard part. Are you ready to tell your mother?" I stared at that message for a long time before responding. Not even a little bit. But I'm going to do it anyway. Because that was the thing about finally finding something real, something that made you feel alive and seen and valued. It gave you courage you didn't know you had. It made you willing to face the storms you'd spent your whole life trying to avoid. Sunday dinner was in 2 days. I had 48 hours to prepare for a conversation that would either free me or blow my entire family apart. Possibly both. I didn't sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't fear keeping me awake. It was something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The 2 days before Sunday dinner passed in a strange blur of normalcy punctuated by moments of surreal awareness. I went to work at the museum, conducted tours for school groups, continued my restoration work on the altarpiece, all while carrying the secret of Alex's identity like a stone in my chest. Every time my phone buzzed with a text from him, I felt a jolt of excitement mixed with dread. We were planning his return to Valdoria, discussing when I might be able to take time off work to visit, talking about logistics while carefully avoiding the elephant in the room, which was how to tell my family any of this. On Saturday afternoon, I met with my grandmother again. She'd invited me over under the pretense of helping her organize some old photographs, but we both knew what the visit was really about. I needed her strength, her perspective, her reminder that there was a world beyond my mother's narrow vision of acceptability. Her brownstone smelled like jasmine tea and old books when I arrived. She was in her parlor, surrounded by albums and loose photographs spread across every surface. But when she saw my face, she set aside the picture she'd been examining and patted the cushion beside her on the settee. "You look like you haven't slept," she observed, her voice gentle but direct in that way only grandmothers can manage. "I haven't, not really," I admitted, sinking down beside her. "Grandma, what if this destroys everything? What if Mom refuses to even hear me out? What if she makes me choose between them and Alex?" My grandmother was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph frame. Then she turned to look at me directly, her eyes sharp despite her age. "Darling, let me tell you something I learned too late in my own life. Some people will try to make you feel guilty for choosing happiness. They'll frame it as selfishness or recklessness or failure to honor family obligations. But here's the truth they don't want you to know. You don't owe anyone your unhappiness. Not your mother, not your father, not anyone. But they're my family," I protested weakly. "And you're their daughter," she countered. "Which means they should want you to thrive, not just to comply. Your mother has spent your entire life trying to shape you into someone she understands. someone who validates her choices and worldview. But you were never meant to be her mirror, Natalie. You're your own person, with your own dreams and your own right to pursue love wherever you find it. I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. What if I'm making a mistake? What if this thing with Alex crashes and burns and I've destroyed my relationship with my family for nothing? My grandmother reached over and lifted a specific photograph from the pile beside her. It showed her as a young woman, maybe in her early 30s, standing in front of what was clearly Valdoria's royal palace. She was laughing, her head thrown back, caught in a moment of pure joy. Beside her stood a man in military uniform, his face turned toward her with an expression that needed no caption. That, she said quietly, pointing to the man, is your grandfather. And this was taken 3 months before I married him. I looked closer at the photograph, confusion furrowing my brow. But you said you met someone else, someone you regretted not choosing. I did, she confirmed. The person who took this photograph. She let that sink in for a moment. I was in love with someone who understood me, who shared my passions, who made me feel alive in ways your grandfather never quite managed. But that person came with complications, with a life that scared me, with choices I wasn't brave enough to make. So I married the safe option, the appropriate choice, the man my family approved of without reservation. She set the photograph down, her fingers lingering on its edges. Your grandfather was a good man, Natalie. I don't want you to think I was miserable every day of our marriage. We built a life together, had your father, created memories I treasure. But there was always a shadow over everything, the ghost of what might have been if I'd had the courage to choose love over approval. Don't make my mistake, darling. Don't let fear of your mother's disappointment rob you of something extraordinary. Her words settled over me like a blanket, warm and heavy and impossible to ignore. I thought about all the years she'd sat through family dinners, watching my mother control and criticize, never directly intervening but always offering me a safe harbor afterward. I wondered if she saw herself in me, if watching me struggle with the same choice she'd faced decades ago was a kind of second chance, a way to rewrite her own story through mine. Did you ever regret it? I asked quietly. Getting married, having dad, building the life you built? She considered the question carefully. Regret is complicated, she said finally. I don't regret your father, or the moments of happiness I found. But I regret not being brave enough to fight for what I really wanted. I regret letting other people's fears become my own. And I regret spending 30 years wondering what my life might have looked like if I'd chosen differently. We sat together in the quiet of her parlor, afternoon light slanting through the windows and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. Outside I could hear the sounds of the neighborhood, cars passing, someone mowing a lawn, children laughing in a nearby yard. Normal life continuing while I sat on the edge of a decision that felt anything but normal. Tomorrow at dinner, I said, the words coming out stronger than I felt. I'm going to tell them about Alex, about who he really is and what this means. My grandmother squeezed my hand. I'll be praying for you. And remember, whatever happens, you have a home here. Always. I left her house as the sun was beginning to set, the sky painted in shades of coral and lavender. Alex had texted earlier asking if I wanted company that evening, but I told him I needed time alone to prepare myself mentally for what was coming. Now, driving through the familiar streets of Ashford, I wondered if any amount of mental preparation could actually ready someone for the conversation I was about to have. Sunday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched my mood perfectly. I stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to wear to potentially blow up my entire family dynamic. Did one dress up for that? Dress down? I finally settled on a simple navy dress, the kind my mother approved of, professional but not flashy. Some small part of me was still trying to make this easier for everyone, still trying to package my rebellion in acceptable wrapping paper. Alex called at noon, his voice warm and concerned. How are you feeling about tonight? Terrified, I admitted. Nauseated. Convinced I'm about to make the biggest mistake of my life, even though I know it's the right thing to do. He was quiet for a moment. Do you want me to come with you? I could be there as support, we could tell them together. The offer was tempting, so tempting I almost said yes immediately. But something stopped me. No, I said slowly. I need to do this myself first. They need to hear it from me, without the complication of you being there in person. Does that make sense? It does, he said, though I could hear the reluctance in his voice. but I'll have my phone on me the entire evening. If you need me, if anything goes wrong, I can be there in 20 minutes. The fact that he understood that he wasn't pushing to be included or trying to control how I handled my family made me love him even more. Thank you, I said softly, for understanding, for being patient with all of this. Natalie, he replied, his voice serious. I've waited my entire life to find something real. I can wait a few more hours for you to navigate this. We talked for a few more minutes before hanging up, and then I was alone with my thoughts and the ticking clock counting down to 6 o'clock when I was expected at the Brooks estate. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, cleaning my already clean apartment, responding to work emails, attempting to read a book I'd been meaning to finish for months. Nothing held my attention for more than a few minutes before my mind wandered back to imagining various scenarios for how dinner might unfold. In the best version, my mother listened calmly, asked thoughtful questions, and gave me her blessing to pursue happiness wherever I found it. In the worst version, she disowned me on the spot. My father backed her up without question, and Brandon smirked at my downfall while Vanessa took mental notes for future gossip sessions with her country club friends. The most likely version fell somewhere in between, a tornado of emotions and accusations and demands that I be reasonable. Think of the family, stop being so dramatic. At 5:30, I got in my car and started the familiar drive to Millbrook Drive. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick and shining, reflecting the gray sky above. I drove slowly, in no hurry to arrive, watching the neighborhood shift from my modest arts district to increasingly wealthy areas where the houses grew larger and the lawns more manicured. The Brooks estate looked the same as it always did, imposing and perfect, every hedge trimmed to identical heights, every window gleaming. My mother's car was already in the circular driveway, as was Brandon's expensive sedan. I parked next to my father's modest vehicle, the one concession to practicality in his otherwise carefully curated life, and sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing deeply and trying to center myself. You can do this, I whispered to my reflection in the rearview mirror. You're 28 years old. You're allowed to make your own choices. You're allowed to be happy. The words felt true even if I didn't quite believe them yet. I walked up the front steps, my heels clicking against the stone, and let myself in with the key I'd had since childhood. The house smelled like it always did, like furniture polish and my mother's signature perfume, and the faint mustiness that comes with old money and older furniture. I could hear voices coming from the formal living room, my mother's sharp laugh and Brandon's deeper tones responding to something. Natalie, my mother's voice called out before I'd even fully closed the door. You're late. Dinner is in 15 minutes. I walked into the living room where the family had gathered for the pre-dinner ritual of cocktails and small talk. My mother stood by the bar cart, already holding a martini glass, her blonde hair perfect as always, her cream-colored dress making her look like an advertisement for country club elegance. My father sat in his usual chair by the fireplace, though no fire burned in the grate this evening, nursing what looked like bourbon. Brandon and Vanessa occupied the love seat, both holding wine glasses, both wearing expressions of mild superiority. Sorry, I said, though I wasn't really. Traffic was heavier than I expected. On a Sunday, my mother said skeptically. In Ashford. She took a sip of her martini, her eyes cataloging my appearance with the precision of a jeweler examining a diamond for flaws. Well, you're here now. Come have a drink. You look like you need one. She wasn't wrong about that. I accepted a glass of white wine from my father, who poured it without comment, and perched on the edge of a wing chair that had belonged to some ancestor whose portrait hung in the upstairs hallway. So, Brandon said, stretching his arm across the back of the love seat in that casual display of ownership he excelled at. I heard an interesting rumor this week. Apparently someone matching your description was seen having dinner with a foreign gentleman at that little restaurant on Maple Street. Multiple times. My heart kicked against my ribs, but I kept my face neutral. I have been seeing someone, I said carefully. I was planning to tell everyone tonight, actually. The room went silent. Even my mother stopped her habitual scanning of the room for imperfections and focused her complete attention on me. My father's hand tightened slightly on his glass. Well, my mother said, her voice carefully controlled in that way that meant she was either very pleased or very displeased and hadn't decided which yet. This is unexpected. Who is he? What's his background? I took a sip of wine, using the moment to steady myself. His name is Alexander, I began. He's from Valdoria, a small European kingdom. He's been in Ashford for the past few months as part of a cultural exchange program with the museum. Valdoria, my mother repeated, her tone suggesting she was rifling through her mental Rolodex of acceptable European connections. I'm not familiar with it. What does his family do? This was it. The moment where I could either continue dancing around the truth, or simply lay it all out and deal with the consequences. I thought about my grandmother's words, about her regret, about the photograph of her laughing in front of a palace, in love with the wrong person but too afraid to choose them. His family is involved in cultural preservation and government, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Actually, his mother is Queen Caroline of Valdoria. Alexander is a prince. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the antique clock on the mantel ticking, each second falling like a stone into still water. My mother's martini glass stopped halfway to her lips. Brandon's mouth actually fell open. Vanessa made a small sound that might have been surprise or might have been the beginning of laughter. Only my father's expression remained unchanged, though his eyes had sharpened with interest. I'm sorry, my mother said finally, her voice dangerous in its quietness. Did you just say you're dating a prince? Yes, I confirmed. Prince Alexander Henrik Frederick of Valdoria. We met at the museum. He's been here studying our Baroque collection and working on cultural exchange initiatives. My mother set down her glass with deliberate care, as if afraid that any sudden movement might shatter something. And you're only mentioning this now? After months of seeing him? After who knows how many people have seen you together and started talking? I wanted to be sure it was serious before involving the family, I said, which was partly true even if the larger truth was that I'd been avoiding this exact moment. Brandon recovered his voice, though he still looked stunned. Prince, he repeated. An actual prince. Nat, do you have any idea what this could mean for the family? The connections, the opportunities, the social standing? I'm not dating him for social standing, I said sharply. I'm dating him because I care about him. Because we connect. Because he makes me happy. Of course, Brandon backpedaled quickly, but his eyes were calculating. I just mean this is incredible. The Brooks family connected to European royalty. Mom, can you imagine what this will do for our position in Ashford society? Let's not get ahead of ourselves, my father interjected, speaking for the first time. He looked at me directly, and I saw something in his expression I couldn't quite read. Natalie, are you certain about this young man? About his intentions? I am, I said. He's genuine, Dad. He didn't even tell me who he really was at first because he wanted me to know him as a person, not as a title. How wonderfully romantic, Vanessa said, and her tone made it impossible to tell if she was being sincere or sarcastic. When do we get to meet this Prince Charming? Actually, I said, taking another fortifying sip of wine. He's invited me to visit Valdoria in a few weeks. To meet his family. To see his world. My mother had been uncharacteristically quiet, but now she stood abruptly, her dress swishing as she moved toward the windows overlooking the back garden. When she finally spoke, her voice was controlled, but I could hear the emotion underneath, though I couldn't identify exactly what emotion it was. This is a lot to process, Natalie. You spring this on us with no warning, no preparation, no thought to how this affects the entire family. What if it doesn't work out? What if you embarrass us in front of European royalty? What if you're in over your head and you don't even realize it? I stood as well, something in me refusing to have this conversation while sitting like a child being scolded. Mom, I understand this is surprising, but this is my life. My relationship. My decision. She turned from the window, and the look on her face made me take an involuntary step back. Your decision, she repeated. Your life. Natalie, when are you going to understand that your choices don't exist in a vacuum? Everything you do reflects on this family. The Brooks name means something in this community, and we've worked hard to maintain our reputation. So my happiness is secondary to protecting the family reputation, I said, and hated how my voice shook. Don't be dramatic, she snapped. I'm simply saying you need to think about the bigger picture. You barely know this man. You have no idea what being involved with royalty actually entails. The scrutiny, the protocols, the expectations. You can barely handle Sunday dinners without getting overwhelmed. The words hit like a slap. Maybe I get overwhelmed at Sunday dinners because I spend them being criticized and micromanaged and reminded that I'm never quite good enough. I shot back, my carefully maintained composure finally cracking. Don't raise your voice to your mother, my father said, though his tone was more tired than angry. Richard, don't, my mother said sharply. She turned back to me, her eyes hard. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to slow down this relationship. You're going to give us time to properly research this family, this kingdom, this entire situation. You're not flying off to Europe to meet a queen without proper preparation and guidance. I'm 28 years old, I said, my voice low and intense. I don't need your permission or your guidance. I came here tonight as a courtesy, to include you in something important to me. But I'm not asking for approval. The room erupted. Brandon jumped in trying to mediate while simultaneously angling to be involved in any royal connections. Vanessa added commentary that was meant to sound supportive, but came across as condescending. My father attempted to restore order while my mother stood rigid with fury, her carefully constructed control beginning to fracture. And then in the middle of the chaos, my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out, ready to silence it, and saw a text from Alex. I hope everything is okay. Remember, I'm here if you need me. And then a moment later another message. Also, I should tell you that my mother would like to formally invite you to Valdoria. The invitation is being sent to your address tomorrow. I thought you should know before it arrives. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. A formal invitation from a queen. Arriving tomorrow. My mother was still talking, still issuing directives about proper behavior and family obligations, but her words seemed to fade into background noise. Mom, I interrupted, my voice cutting through her monologue. There's something else you should know. I'm receiving a formal invitation from Queen Caroline tomorrow to visit Valdoria as Prince Alexander's guest. The silence was back, heavier this time, weighted with implications everyone was processing. My mother's face cycled through several emotions too quickly to name before settling on something between shock and calculation. A formal invitation, she repeated slowly. From the Queen. Yes, I confirmed. This isn't some casual relationship that's going to fade away. This is serious. He's serious. And I'm serious about him. My mother sank back into her chair, her martini forgotten on the side table, her perfectly composed expression finally showing cracks. A formal invitation from Queen Caroline herself. The words seemed to echo in the formal living room, bouncing off the expensive wallpaper and antique furniture that had always been more important to her than the people who lived among them. Brandon recovered first, his businessman instincts kicking in even as his face showed his shock. Okay, he said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Okay, this is real. This is actually happening. Nat, you need to understand what an opportunity this is, not just for you but for all of us. Do you have any idea the kind of doors this could open? I'm not interested in using Alex to open doors, I said firmly, surprised by the steel in my own voice. I love him because of who he is, not what he can do for the Brooks family social standing. Vanessa let out a laugh that was half admiration, half disbelief. Love, she said. You're in love with the prince. This is like something out of a movie. It's my life, I corrected. Not a movie. Not a fairy tale. My actual life with actual consequences and actual feelings. My father, who had been uncharacteristically quiet through most of this exchange, set down his bourbon glass and looked at me with an expression I'd rarely seen from him, something that looked almost like respect. Natalie, he said carefully, setting aside your mother's concerns about timing and preparation, I need to ask you something important. Are you happy? Does this young man treat you well? The question caught me off guard. In all the years of Sunday dinners and family obligations and carefully calibrated expectations, I couldn't remember my father ever asking me directly about my happiness. It had always been implied that happiness would naturally follow from making the right choices, marrying the right person, maintaining the right social connections. The idea that happiness itself might be the goal, rather than a pleasant side effect of proper behavior, seemed foreign to everything the Brooks family stood for. Yes, I said, and felt tears prickling at my eyes. Dad, I'm happier than I've ever been. He sees me, really sees me, not as an extension of the family name or a project to be managed, but as myself. He listens when I talk about my work. He asks questions because he's genuinely interested, not because he's being polite. He makes me laugh. He makes me feel like I matter. My mother made a sound somewhere between a scoff and a sob. Of course you matter, she said. But her voice lacked its usual conviction. You're our daughter. We've always wanted what's best for you. No, I said gently but firmly. You've always wanted what you thought was best for me. And those are two very different things. You've wanted me to marry someone from the right family, to make the right connections, to reflect well on the Brooks name. But you've never asked what would actually make me happy. That's not fair, my mother protested. But the words came out weak, uncertain in a way I'd never heard from her before. Isn't it? I asked. When was the last time you asked me about my work at the museum without following it up with a comment about how it's time to think about my future? When was the last Sunday dinner where I didn't leave feeling like I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking? When have you ever just been happy for me without qualifications or conditions? My father cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. Perhaps this conversation is getting away from us, he suggested. The important thing is that Natalie has met someone who seems to make her happy, and while the circumstances are certainly unusual, we should be supporting her, not interrogating her. Supporting her, my mother repeated, something sharp creeping back into her voice. Richard, our daughter is about to become involved with European royalty. There are protocols, expectations, standards of behavior that she knows nothing about. If she embarrasses herself or this family in front of a queen, we'll never recover from it. Then help me, I said, the words surprising me even as I spoke them. If you're so concerned about protocols and proper behavior, help me navigate this. Come with me to Valdoria. Meet Alex and his family. Be part of this instead of trying to control it from a distance. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. My mother stared at me, her mouth slightly open, clearly not having expected this response. Brandon sat back, his expression thoughtful. Vanessa looked between everyone like she was watching a tennis match. My father's eyes moved from me to my mother and back again. You want us to come with you, my mother said slowly. To meet the Queen of Valdoria. I want you to meet the man I love and his family, I corrected. Yes, his mother happens to be a queen, but she's also just a mother who wants her son to be happy. Grandmother says she's kind, thoughtful, that she cares more about character than titles. I think you might actually like her if you gave her a chance. The mention of my grandmother seemed to shift something in the room. My mother's expression flickered with an emotion I couldn't quite read. Your grandmother, she said. Lady Margaret. Of course she's involved in this somehow. Grandma worked for the Valdorian royal family when she was young, I explained. She knows them. She's the one who recognized Alex when I described him to her. And yes, she's been supportive because she understands what it's like to let fear and family expectations dictate your choices. She doesn't want me to make the same mistakes she did. My mother stood abruptly and walked back to the window, her shoulders rigid. I've always known Margaret disapproved of me, she said quietly. The way she looks at me during family gatherings, like I'm some social climber who trapped her son. Mom, I started, but she held up a hand. No, let me finish. She turned back to face us, and I was startled to see genuine vulnerability in her expression. You think I don't know what people say about me? That Patricia Brooks is controlling, that she's obsessed with status, that she micromanages her children's lives? I hear the whispers. I see the looks at the country club. Then why, I asked gently. Why do you keep doing it if you know how it looks? She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. Because I'm terrified of becoming irrelevant. Because in our world, if you're not controlling the narrative, you're being controlled by it. Because I grew up poor, Natalie, and I clawed my way into this life. And I'm terrified every single day that it could all disappear if I make one wrong move. The confession hung in the air, raw and unexpected. I'd known abstractly that my mother came from a modest background, that she'd married my father partly for security and position. But I'd never heard her speak about it with such naked fear, such admission of the anxiety that drove her constant need for control. I didn't know you felt that way, I said softly. Well, now you do, she replied, some of her usual sharpness returning to her voice. So forgive me if I'm skeptical about fairy tales and princes and invitations from queens. In my experience, things that seem too good to be true usually are. What if it's not too good to be true, I asked. What if it's just good? What if I've actually found something real and worth fighting for? My father stood and walked over to my mother, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of solidarity I hadn't seen from them in years. Patricia, he said gently, Maybe it's time we let Natalie make her own choices and deal with her own consequences. She's not a child anymore. But what if she gets hurt? My mother asked, and suddenly I realized that beneath all the control and criticism and impossible expectations, there was actual concern. It was misguided and smothering and often toxic, but it came from a place of wanting to protect me from the kind of pain and disappointment she'd experienced in her own life. Then I'll get hurt, I said. And I'll survive it, just like you survived whatever pain led you to build these walls around yourself. But I'd rather risk getting hurt than spend my life playing it safe and wondering what might have been. Brandon, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. I think we should go, he said. All of us. To Valdoria. If Nat's really serious about this guy, we should meet him properly. And honestly, how often does an opportunity like this come along? A private audience with European royalty? Vanessa immediately chimed in her agreement, already probably planning what designer gowns she'd need to purchase for the trip. But my focus stayed on my parents, on the silent conversation happening between them in that way couples who've been together for decades can communicate without words. Finally, my mother sighed. A sound of resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. Fine, she said. We'll go to Valdoria. We'll meet your prince and his mother and see this world you're so eager to join. But Natalie, if this goes badly, if you end up heartbroken and humiliated, don't say I didn't warn you. It wasn't the enthusiastic support I might have hoped for, but it was more than I'd expected when I walked through the door that evening. I'll take that risk, I said. The rest of the dinner passed in a strange atmosphere of tension mixed with grudging acceptance. Brandon peppered me with questions about Valdorian politics and economy, already researching business opportunities. Vanessa wanted to know about fashion and what one wore to meet a queen. My father asked thoughtful questions about Alex's work in cultural preservation, seeming genuinely interested in the substance rather than just the status. My mother remained mostly quiet, occasionally interjecting with warnings about protocol or reminders that this was all highly unusual. When I finally left the Brooks estate that evening, it was nearly 11 o'clock. The night had turned cold, autumn asserting itself fully, and I sat in my car for a few minutes with the engine running, processing everything that had happened. My phone showed several missed texts from Alex, each one progressively more concerned as the evening had worn on. I called him instead of texting back. He answered on the first ring. How did it go? He asked, his voice tight with worry. I've been going crazy imagining every possible scenario. They're coming to Valdoria, I said, still slightly stunned by this fact. My whole family. They want to meet you properly, meet your mother, see what this world is really like. He was quiet for a moment. And how do you feel about that? Terrified, I admitted. But also relieved. I think some part of me was afraid I'd have to choose between them and you. And now maybe I won't have to. Or at least not yet. Natalie, he said gently, I need you to understand something. My mother will love you because you're genuine and passionate, and exactly the kind of person she's always hoped I'd find. But she's also going to be evaluating whether you can handle the life that comes with being involved with someone in my position. The scrutiny, the public appearances, the constant balancing act between duty and personal happiness. I know, I said. I'm scared of all of that. But I'm more scared of not trying, of letting fear win like my grandmother did, of waking up 30 years from now and wondering what might have been. Then we'll figure it out together, he promised. When does your family want to come? The invitation arrives tomorrow, I reminded him. I assume there's a suggested timeline? Mother suggested 3 weeks from now, he replied. There's a cultural festival that weekend, which would give your family a chance to see Valdoria at its best. Plus it's a good excuse for an official visit without making it seem like we're rushing things. 3 weeks, I repeated, my stomach flipping at how soon that actually was. 3 weeks to prepare myself and my family for meeting a queen. We'll prepare together, Alex said. I'll help you understand the protocols, what to expect, how to navigate it all. And Natalie, whatever happens, whatever your family thinks or says or does, know that what I feel for you isn't going to change. After we hung up, I drove home through the quiet streets of Ashford, passing the museum where we'd met, the cafe where we'd had our first real conversation, all the places that had become meaningful over the past few months. My apartment felt different when I walked in, smaller somehow but also cozier, like it had transformed from a hiding place into a launching pad. The next morning, I called my grandmother to tell her everything that had happened at Sunday dinner. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished I could hear the smile in her voice. "I'm proud of you, darling. I know that wasn't easy. It was terrible, I admit it. But also necessary. And Mom said some things about her past, about why she is the way she is. I never realized how much fear was driving all that control. Fear makes us do strange things," my grandmother said quietly. "Your mother and I have never understood each other. Partly because we come from such different worlds. But I hope this trip might help bridge some of those gaps. Seeing Valdoria again, meeting Caroline after all these years, maybe it will remind her that there are different ways to build a life, different definitions of success and security." "You really think the Queen will remember you?" I asked. "Oh, she'll remember me," my grandmother said with a certainty that made me curious about stories I suspected I'd never fully hear. "We went through some complicated times together. You don't forget the people who see you at your worst and still choose to be your friend." The formal invitation arrived that afternoon via courier, delivered in a cream envelope with a wax seal bearing the Valdorian royal crest. Inside, on heavy cardstock that felt like history under my fingers, Queen Caroline formally invited Miss Natalie Brooks and her family to be guests of the royal household during the upcoming Festival of Arts and Culture. The language was formal but warm, welcoming without being effusive. Exactly the kind of careful balance I was starting to understand characterized everything in Alex's world. I photographed the invitation and sent it to my family group chat, which immediately exploded with messages. Brandon wanted to know about accommodations and whether there would be official photographs. Vanessa asked about dress codes and whether she should hire a stylist. My father sent a simple message saying he'd begun researching Valdorian history and customs. My mother didn't respond for several hours, and when she finally did, it was just 2 words. "We'll need coaching." She wasn't wrong. The next 3 weeks became a crash course in everything I'd never known about royal protocol and diplomatic etiquette. Alex connected me with one of his mother's ladies-in-waiting, a kind woman named Isabel who conducted video calls walking me through everything from proper forms of address to what topics were considered appropriate conversation at formal dinners. I learned about curtsying, about when to speak and when to stay silent, about the intricate dance of royal events where everything meant something and nothing was as casual as it appeared. My family joined some of these sessions, and I watched my mother transform into a student absorbing every detail with the same intensity she brought to social climbing in Ashford. Brandon took notes like he was preparing for a business negotiation. Vanessa created entire spreadsheets of appropriate outfits for different occasions. Even my father, usually content to fade into the background, asked thoughtful questions about Valdorian history and political structure. Through it all, Alex and I talked every day, video calls that stretched late into the night where he'd tell me stories about growing up in the palace, about his brother Henrik who took royal duty so seriously it sometimes seemed like he'd forgotten how to be a person, about his mother who balanced being a queen with being remarkably down-to-earth in private moments. He also warned me about the challenges. The press would be interested in me once our relationship became public. There would be expectations about how I dressed, how I spoke, who I associated with. Privacy would become a precious commodity. Every mistake would be magnified. Every success scrutinized for hidden meanings. I won't lie and say I wasn't intimidated. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was completely out of my mind, if I was throwing away a perfectly good life for something that would chew me up and spit me out. But then I'd remember how Alex looked at me, how he listened when I talked about art restoration techniques most people found boring, how he made me laugh with dry observations about diplomatic protocols. I'd remember my grandmother's regret, her warning not to let fear steal something precious. The day before we were scheduled to fly to Valdoria, my grandmother invited me over for tea one final time. Her parlor looked the same as always, filled with afternoon light and the scent of jasmine and memories. But this time she had something specific she wanted to give me. She pulled out a small velvet box from her desk drawer and placed it in my hands. Inside was a delicate bracelet, silver with tiny sapphires set in an intricate pattern. "It's Valdorian," she explained. "A gift from Caroline years ago. I want you to wear it when you meet her. She'll recognize it, and it will tell her something important about you." "What will it tell her?" I asked, fastening the bracelet around my wrist where it caught the light beautifully. "That you come from people who understand loyalty," my grandmother said. "That you're connected to her history in ways she didn't expect. That you're not just some American girl Alex met randomly, but someone with roots that touch her own story." We sat together in comfortable silence, drinking tea and watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across her hardwood floors. Finally, I asked the question I'd been holding back for weeks. Grandma, do you regret it? Coming back to America, marrying grandfather, choosing the safe path instead of staying in Valdoria? She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then she turned to me with eyes that held decades of complicated emotions. I regret not being brave enough to fight for what I really wanted, she said. I don't regret your father, or the life I built, or the moments of happiness I found. But I regret the person I might have been if I'd had more courage. Don't make that same mistake, Natalie. Whatever happens in Valdoria, whatever challenges you face, at least you'll know you were brave enough to try. The flight to Valdoria felt both endless and far too short. We flew first class thanks to arrangements made by the royal household, and I spent most of the journey staring out the window or reviewing my notes on protocol. My mother sat ramrod straight in her seat, barely touching the champagne the flight attendants offered, her anxiety manifesting as rigid control over every aspect of her appearance and behavior. Brandon worked on his laptop, already drafting business proposals he hoped to present to Valdorian contacts. Vanessa flipped through fashion magazines, dog-earing pages with outfits she deemed appropriate for meeting royalty. My father read a thick book on Valdorian history, occasionally making notes in the margins. We landed in Valdoria's small international airport to find a car waiting, an elegant but understated vehicle with diplomatic plates. The driver introduced himself as Henrik, not to be confused with the Crown Prince, he clarified with a small smile, and he'd be our guide during our stay. As we drove from the airport toward the capital city, I pressed my face against the window, taking in my first real views of the country Alex had described so vividly. It was more beautiful than I'd imagined. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding on to the last of autumn's snow. The capital city of Aurelia spread across rolling hills, a perfect blend of medieval architecture and modern development. Church spires reached toward a sky that seemed impossibly blue, and everywhere I looked there were flower boxes overflowing with late-season blooms. The streets were clean, the people we passed looked prosperous and content, and there was a sense of order without sterility, tradition without stagnation. We're staying at the palace, Henrik informed us as we wound through increasingly exclusive neighborhoods. Her Majesty insisted on having you as her personal guests rather than in a hotel. She's quite eager to meet you all, especially Miss Brooks. My stomach clenched with nerves. In a few hours I'd be meeting a queen. Alex's mother. A woman who had been my grandmother's friend decades ago. A woman who would be evaluating whether I was suitable for her son. The palace appeared gradually as we crested a hill. First just glimpses of stone walls and towers, then the full magnificent structure spreading across the hillside like something out of a storybook. It wasn't as massive as some European palaces I'd seen in photographs, but it was elegant, proportioned perfectly to be impressive without being overwhelming. The stone glowed golden in the afternoon sun, and the gardens surrounding it were immaculate without looking artificial. Oh my God, Vanessa breathed, speaking for all of us. We pulled through gates where guards in dress uniforms nodded to Henrik, past fountains and manicured lawns, finally stopping at the main entrance where staff waited to help with our luggage. And there, standing at the top of the stone steps, was Alex. He looked different here, more formal in tailored slacks and a jacket that somehow communicated both casual elegance and undeniable authority. But when he smiled when he saw me getting out of the car, his whole face transformed into the Alex I knew, the one who'd stood in the museum studying Caravaggio, the one who'd listened to my stories about art restoration like they were the most fascinating things he'd ever heard. "Welcome to Valdoria," he said, coming down the steps to greet us. And then just to me, quietly enough that only I could hear, "I'm so glad you're here." My mother stepped forward, and I watched her shift into her social mode, the one she used for important occasions. "Your Highness," she began, and I could hear how carefully she'd practiced the form of address. "Thank you so much for your hospitality." "Please," Alex said with genuine warmth. "Call me Alexander or Alex if you're comfortable. Your Highness makes me feel like I'm at an official state function." He shook hands with my father, greeted Brandon and Vanessa with the same easy charm, making everyone feel welcome without being obsequious. It was a masterclass in royal courtesy, and I could see my mother relaxing slightly, some of her rigid anxiety easing. Staff showed my family to their guest rooms, all in one wing of the palace so they'd be together. My room was separate in another wing, which Alex explained was because I'd be spending more time with the family, and it made sense for me to be closer to the royal apartments. My mother's eyebrows raised at this, but she didn't comment. My room was beautiful, all high ceilings and antique furniture and windows overlooking the gardens. There were fresh flowers on the dresser, books in English on the nightstand, and hanging in the wardrobe I found several dresses in my size with a note in elegant handwriting. These are merely suggestions for various occasions during your stay. Please feel free to wear your own clothes if you prefer. But I thought having options might be helpful. Welcome to Valdoria, Caroline. I ran my fingers over the dresses, each one clearly expensive but also thoughtful, chosen for someone who appreciated understated elegance over flashy displays of wealth. It was a small gesture that told me a lot about the woman I was about to meet. That evening, we were invited to a private family dinner. Not a state function, Alex assured me. Just you, your family, my mother, my brother, and a few close family friends. Nothing formal. But when we gathered in an elegant but intimate dining room, I realized that nothing in Alex's world was ever truly casual. Crown Prince Henrik was there, tall and serious and carrying himself with the weight of someone who would one day rule. Queen Caroline sat at the head of the table, and I understood immediately why my grandmother had spoken of her with such affection. She was in her late 50s, her dark hair threaded with silver, her face showing lines of laughter and wisdom. But it was her eyes that caught me, warm and intelligent and genuinely kind. She stood when we entered, which surprised me because queens don't generally stand for anyone. But she moved around the table to greet each of my family members personally, putting them at ease with practiced grace. When she came to me, she paused, studying my face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. Natalie, she said softly, and I heard echoes of European aristocracy in her accent. Alexander has told me so much about you. And I see you're wearing Margaret's bracelet. I touched the silver and sapphire piece on my wrist. My grandmother wanted you to know she's thinking of you. Something shifted in the Queen's expression. A flicker of old memories and complex emotions. Margaret, she repeated. I haven't seen her in 30 years, and yet I recognize her influence in you immediately. That same quiet strength, that same refusal to be diminished. She smiled. You must tell me how she is. Dinner was extraordinary, not just for the food, which was excellent, but for the conversation. Queen Caroline asked thoughtful questions about my work at the museum, about my approach to art restoration, about my thoughts on making cultural treasures accessible to the public. She engaged my father in discussion about American history, found common ground with my mother on the challenges of maintaining family legacy, even managed to charm Brandon by asking intelligent questions about his business. I watched Alex throughout the meal, saw him relax in a way he never quite did in Ashford, saw the easy affection between him and his mother, the respectful relationship with his brother despite their different approaches to royal duty. This was his world, these were his people, and seeing him in this context made me understand him in ways I hadn't before. After dinner, Queen Caroline asked if I'd join her for coffee in her private sitting room. It was clearly not optional, though she phrased it as a request. We walked through elegant corridors hung with paintings I itched to examine more closely, finally arriving at a room that felt more like a comfortable study than a royal apartment. Sit, please, she said, gesturing to a couch near a fireplace where a small fire burned despite the mild evening. She poured coffee herself rather than calling for staff, an intimacy that felt deliberate. Now, she said, settling into the chair across from me, tell me about my son. Tell me what you see when you look at him. I knew this was a test, but I also knew the only way to pass it was to be completely honest. I see someone who's passionate about art and culture, and preserving beauty for future generations, I said. Someone who's thoughtful and kind and funny in ways he doesn't always let people see. Someone who carries the weight of expectations with grace, but who sometimes looks tired from always balancing what he wants with what's required of him. She was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee. And does that weight frighten you? The idea of sharing that burden? Terrifies me, I admitted. I'm not from this world, Your Majesty. I don't understand the protocols or the expectations or how to navigate any of this. But I also know that watching him walk away would hurt more than any of that scares me. Queen Caroline set down her cup, her expression softening. My dear girl, do you know what first caught my attention when Alexander told me about you? It wasn't that you work in a museum or that you're intelligent or even that you're quite lovely. It was the way his voice changed when he said your name. I haven't heard that tone from him in years, perhaps ever. Hope mixed with vulnerability. Fear mixed with excitement. That's how I knew you were different. She stood and walked to a window overlooking the gardens, now shadowy in the deepening twilight. Being part of this family isn't easy, she continued. The press will scrutinize everything about you. People will question whether you're good enough, whether you're here for the right reasons. There will be days when you want to walk away from all of it. But if you stay, if you choose this path, I want you to know that you'll have my support. Not because of who your grandmother was, though Margaret's recommendation carries weight, but because you make my son happy, and that's something I've wanted for him for a very long time. I felt tears prickling at my eyes. Thank you, I managed to say. She turned back to me with a smile that held understanding and warmth. Now, she said, let's talk about your family. Your mother is quite concerned about making sure everyone behaves appropriately. I'm going to assign Isabel to help with the details of the festival this weekend, but I want you to know that we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for authenticity. Can you help your mother understand that? I'll try, I said, though we both knew my mother's relationship with authenticity was complicated at best. The rest of the evening passed in conversation that ranged from art to politics to family stories. Queen Caroline told me about Alex as a boy, always with his nose in a book, always asking why things had to be done certain ways. She spoke warmly about my grandmother, carefully avoiding details that I suspected involved complicated emotional territory. She told me about Valdoria, about the balance they tried to maintain between tradition and progress, about the challenges of ruling a small kingdom in a modern world. When I finally returned to my room, exhausted but exhilarated, I found a text from Alex. How did it go with Mother? I think she approves, I responded. Or at least she doesn't disapprove. His reply came immediately. She asked me to come see her after you left. She said you reminded her of someone she knew once, someone brave enough to pursue an unconventional path despite everyone's warnings. I think that was a compliment. I lay in bed in a palace room in a European kingdom, wearing my grandmother's bracelet, having just received a queen's tentative blessing, and thought about how completely my life had transformed in a matter of months. Tomorrow the festival would begin. My family would be on full display, and the Valdorian public would get their first glimpse of the American woman who had captured their prince's heart. It should have terrified me. Instead, I felt something closer to anticipation, because whatever came next, I wouldn't be facing it alone. I had Alex, who saw me for exactly who I was. I had my grandmother's support, her blessing to be braver than she'd been. And now, unexpectedly, I had a queen in my corner. A woman who understood the complexity of balancing duty with desire, tradition with personal happiness. The Brooks family annual gala was in 2 weeks, scheduled long before any of this had happened. The formal invitation from Queen Caroline had created ripples through Ashford society that had apparently reached tidal wave proportions. My mother had called 3 times in the past 2 days, her voice tight with a mixture of pride and panic. Everyone wants to know about Valdoria, she'd said. Everyone wants to meet you now. The same people who look through you at every function are suddenly desperate for your attention. There was satisfaction in that, I couldn't deny it. But there was also a strange discomfort. I didn't want to be valued because of who I was dating. I wanted to be valued for myself. Alex had warned me about this, about how the title changed everything, how people who'd never noticed you suddenly couldn't look away. On our last day in Valdoria, Alex took me on a private tour of the Royal Art Collection. We walked through galleries hung with masterpieces, him sharing stories about various pieces, me occasionally stopping to examine technique or composition. At the end of one long corridor, he opened a door I hadn't noticed, revealing a small studio flooded with north light. This is where I come when I need to think, he said. When court protocols get too heavy and I need to remember who I am underneath the title. The room was clearly well used, with easels and art supplies and works in progress scattered about. I hadn't known he painted. He showed me his work, mostly landscapes and architectural studies, all technically proficient, but also carrying an emotional weight that surprised me. He painted like someone trying to capture moments before they disappeared. This is beautiful, I said, studying a piece showing the palace gardens at dawn. Why didn't you tell me you painted? He shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. Because it's mine. The one thing I do that has nothing to do with duty or expectation or representing the crown. Bringing you here feels like letting you see the part of me no one else gets to know. I turned to him, understanding the significance of this moment. Thank you, I said, for trusting me with this. He pulled me close, and we stood there in his private studio, surrounded by his secret art, and I felt the weight of what we were building together. It wasn't just romance or attraction or even love, though it was all of those things. It was partnership, mutual understanding, two people trying to be fully themselves while navigating impossible expectations. The Brooks family gala was held at the Grand Ashford Hotel, the same venue where countless charity events and society functions had cemented social hierarchies and reinforced community standards. I'd been to dozens of these events over the years, always feeling like I was performing rather than participating, always aware that I was being judged and usually found wanting. This time was different. I arrived with my family, but I arrived knowing that Alex was flying in that evening, that he'd be joining us for the gala at my mother's insistence. She'd been insufferable in the lead-up, transforming the annual event into what she clearly hoped would be her crowning social achievement, hosting royalty at a Brooks family function. The ballroom looked the same as it always did, crystal chandeliers throwing prisms of light across polished floors, round tables draped in expensive linens, flower arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But the energy was different. People who had barely acknowledged my existence at previous events now greeted me with enthusiastic warmth, their eyes bright with curiosity barely disguised as friendliness. Natalie, one woman gushed, someone who'd called me Emily multiple times at past galas. You look absolutely radiant. You simply must tell us all about Valdoria. I smiled politely, making non-committal small talk, all while feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. This was what my mother had always wanted for me, to be the center of social interest, to matter in the only way she understood mattering. But standing there in my expensive dress, wearing jewelry borrowed from my grandmother, fielding questions from people who'd never cared before, I felt more disconnected than ever. Alex arrived fashionably late as we'd planned, making an entrance that had the entire ballroom turning to stare. He was in formal evening wear, moving with that unconscious authority that came from a lifetime of knowing your presence mattered. But when his eyes found mine across the room, when his entire face softened into that private smile that was just for me, I felt my discomfort ease. He made his way through the crowd with practiced grace, greeting my parents and Brandon and Vanessa before finally reaching me. Miss Brooks, he said formally, though his eyes danced with private humor. Thank you for inviting me this evening. We danced and the crowd parted to watch us, and I realized this was the moment my life truly became public. Tomorrow, there would be photos in local papers and social media posts and endless speculation about the Brooks girl and her royal boyfriend. Privacy, that precious commodity Alex had warned me about, would become increasingly rare. As we moved across the floor, he leaned close and whispered, "Are you all right? You seem tense." "Everyone's watching us," I murmured back. "Everyone's judging, speculating, measuring whether I'm good enough for you." He pulled back slightly to look at my face. "And what do you think? Are you good enough for me?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know," I admitted. "Some days I think yes, absolutely. Other days I wonder if I'm completely deluding myself." He stopped dancing, right there in the middle of the ballroom floor with everyone watching, and looked at me with such intensity that the rest of the room seemed to fade away. "Natalie," he said clearly enough that people nearby could probably hear. "I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly, not based on what you think I want to hear or what anyone else expects." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Okay," I whispered. "Do you love me? Not the title, not the palace, not the opportunities or connections or any of that. Just me. The person who stands too long in museums and burns toast and paints landscapes he'll never show anyone. Do you love that person?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I love that person more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." He smiled then, a smile so genuine and full of relief that it transformed his entire face. "Then that's all that matters. Everything else, all the protocol and expectations and public scrutiny, we'll figure that out together. But as long as we have that foundation, as long as we're choosing each other first, the rest is just logistics." The music had stopped, I realized. The entire ballroom had gone silent, everyone straining to hear our conversation. And I understood in that moment that this was it, the point of no return. If I walked away now, if I let fear or social pressure or my family's expectations dictate my choices, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Just like my grandmother had. I stood on tiptoe and kissed him, right there in front of everyone, in front of my mother and the society women who'd spent years judging me, in front of Brandon and Vanessa and everyone who'd ever thought I wasn't quite good enough for the Brooks family standards. It wasn't a long kiss or particularly dramatic, just a clear statement of choice and commitment. When we pulled apart, the ballroom erupted in applause. My mother stood at the edge of the dance floor, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to name before settling on something that looked almost like pride. My grandmother, who'd arrived late and quietly, stood beside her with tears streaming down her face and a smile that held decades of complicated feelings. Later, after we'd made it through dinner and speeches and endless rounds of people wanting to congratulate us or tell us their own stories of unlikely romance, Alex and I escaped to a balcony overlooking the city. The November air was cold but clear, and in the distance I could see the lights of Ashford spreading across the valley like fallen stars. "There's something I need to tell you," Alex said, his voice suddenly serious. "My mother is hosting an official state dinner in 3 months. She wants to use it as an opportunity to formally introduce you to Valdorian society and the diplomatic community. It would be making our relationship officially public on an international stage." "That sounds terrifying," I said honestly. "It will be," he agreed. "There will be photographers and journalists and diplomats from a dozen countries all watching your every move. You'll be expected to navigate conversations in multiple languages, remember protocols, represent not just yourself but your connection to the royal family." "And if I'm not ready?" I asked. "If I can't handle that kind of pressure?" He turned to face me fully, taking both my hands in his. "Then we'll wait. Or we'll find another way. Natalie, I need you to understand something. I love you and I want you in my life, but not at the cost of your happiness or well-being. If the public scrutiny becomes too much, if the expectations crush who you are, then we'll figure out a different path. Because I'd rather have you happy and in my life privately than miserable and on display publicly." The fact that he meant it, that he was genuinely willing to prioritize my well-being over royal expectations or public perception, made me love him even more. "What if I want to try?" I said slowly. "What if I'm scared but willing to take the risk? Then I'll be beside you every step of the way," he promised. "And my mother will help, and Isabel will coach you through everything, and you'll have an entire support system because contrary to what your family taught you, you're not expected to figure everything out alone." We stood together in the cold November air, and I thought about my grandmother's words, about courage and regret and the cost of playing it safe. I thought about my mother's fear-driven need for control and my father's passive acceptance of whatever made waves smallest. I thought about the museum curator I'd been just months ago, content in my small life, never imagining I'd be standing on a balcony with a prince discussing international state dinners. "I want to try," I said firmly. "I'm terrified and completely out of my depth and probably going to make mistakes, but I want to try. Because you're right, what we have is worth fighting for, worth being brave for." He kissed me again, softer this time, and I tasted salt and realized I was crying without having noticed when the tears started. These were good tears though, tears of relief and fear and hope all tangled together. When we went back inside, my mother found me almost immediately. She looked different somehow, less rigid, like something fundamental had shifted in her. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. "Just the two of us?" We found a quiet corner away from the main ballroom, and for a long moment she just looked at me, really looked at me in a way she hadn't in years. "I was wrong," she said finally. "About so many things. About what mattered, about what would make you happy, about what success actually means." "Mom," I started, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish," she said. "I spent your entire childhood trying to shape you into someone who would validate my choices, prove that I'd made it, that I belonged in this world I'd fought so hard to join. I was so focused on external markers of success that I forgot to ask if you were actually happy. And watching you tonight, seeing you with Alexander, seeing the way you've blossomed since meeting him, I realized I've been measuring all the wrong things." She paused, gathering herself. "Your grandmother and I had a long conversation at the Valdorian Palace," she continued. "She told me things about her past, about choices she made and regretted. And she made me understand that by trying to protect you from failure and disappointment, I was actually preventing you from fully living." "I'm sorry, Natalie. I'm so sorry for all the years I made you feel like you weren't enough exactly as you were. I hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for my mother to show this kind of vulnerability. We're not going to have a perfect relationship overnight, I said gently. There's a lot of history, a lot of hurt that needs healing. But I appreciate you saying this. I appreciate you seeing me. She nodded, tears making her mascara run slightly. Something that would have mortified her an hour ago, but now she didn't seem to notice. I want to try to be better, she said. To be the mother you deserved all along. Will you let me try? Yes, I said simply. Because beneath my anger and hurt, there was still love, still hope that maybe we could build something new from the broken pieces of what we'd had. The gala continued late into the night, but eventually even the most persistent guests began to leave. My family gathered near the entrance, and for the first time I could remember, we stood together without tension crackling between us. Brandon clapped Alex on the shoulder like they were old friends rather than recent acquaintances. Vanessa hugged me with what seemed like genuine affection. My father shook Alex's hand with quiet approval, and my mother, surprising everyone, pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than protocol required. 3 months later, I stood in a palace ballroom in Valdoria wearing a gown that cost more than my annual salary, my hair styled by professionals who'd worked on actual royalty, my grandmother's bracelet glinting on my wrist alongside a ring Alex had given me the night before. Not an engagement ring but a promise ring, a symbol that we were building toward something permanent. The state dinner was everything he'd warned me about and more. Diplomats and dignitaries from around the world, conversations that switched between languages mid-sentence, cameras flashing from designated press areas, every moment choreographed and meaningful. But Alex stayed beside me, his hand occasionally finding mine under the table, his eyes catching mine across crowded conversations with looks that said we're in this together. Queen Caroline introduced me to the assembled guests as someone special to her son, someone the family welcomed, and I felt the weight of that endorsement, the way it shifted how people looked at me. My family was there too, dressed in their finest, navigating this world with varying degrees of success but all of them trying. All of them supporting rather than undermining. When the formal dinner ended and dancing began, Alex led me onto the floor for the first waltz. This time, unlike at the Ashford Gala, I wasn't tense or worried about being watched. I'd learned that scrutiny came with this life, that privacy was precious but not always possible, that being with Alex meant accepting a certain level of public interest in our relationship. But I'd also learned that I was stronger than I'd thought, that the woman who'd felt invisible and inadequate at Brooks' family dinners had been masking someone capable and brave underneath. That love, real love, didn't diminish you to fit someone else's expectations, but instead expanded you to become more fully yourself. Later that night, after the last guests had left and the palace had settled into quiet, Alex and I walked through the gardens under a sky full of stars. We talked about the future, about practicalities and dreams, about how we'd balance my work at the museum with his royal obligations, about where we'd live and how we'd build a life that honored both his responsibilities and my independence. I never expected this, I told him. 6 months ago, I was just a museum curator living a quiet life. Now I'm in a palace garden planning a future with the prince. He pulled me close, wrapping his arms around me against the night chill. And I never expected to walk into a museum and find the person who made me want to be brave enough to choose love over duty, he said. But here we are. Here we are, I agreed. And despite all the challenges ahead, despite the scrutiny and expectations and complications, I wouldn't change any of it. Because this, right here, this was worth every risk I'd taken to get here. My phone buzzed with a text from my grandmother. I saw the photos from tonight. You were radiant. Your mother called me in tears, the good kind this time, saying she was proud of you. I think we're all healing, darling. I think we're all finally learning what actually matters. I showed the message to Alex and he smiled. Your family is quite something, he observed. They are, I agreed. Complicated and difficult and slowly learning to be better. But they're trying, and I think that's all anyone can really ask. We stood together in the palace gardens, and I thought about all the moments that had led here. My mother's controlling dinners and my grandmother's regrets. The day I'd met Alex in the museum and the night I'd told my family about him. The formal invitation from a queen and the state dinner where I'd been officially welcomed into a world I'd never imagined being part of. But mostly I thought about courage, about the bravery it takes to choose love over fear, authenticity over approval, your own path over the one laid out for you. My grandmother had spent 30 years regretting not being brave enough. I wouldn't make that mistake. Whatever challenges came next, whatever scrutiny or expectations or complications, I'd face them knowing I'd been brave enough to choose love, brave enough to choose myself, brave enough to believe I deserved happiness. And in the end, that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.